They say dignity can't be bought, but tonight it felt like every dollar he'd saved, every drop of sweat, and every ache in his bones had been spent just to be humiliated under the glow of crystal chandeliers. Standing there, fists clenched and jaw tight, the taste of shame was bitter as oil on his tongue. He heard laughter drifting from velvet booths, saw judgmental eyes slipping past him like shadows. All he'd ever wanted was to show his daughter a glimpse of something better, one perfect night away from the grease-stained hands and endless debts. But sometimes the world reminds you exactly where it thinks you belong. And sometimes when you have got nothing left to lose, fate sends a stranger to remind you just who you are. Marshall Reeves had never been the type to believe in luck or miracles. At 42, he had spent most of his life working with his hands, first as a mechanic in the Army, then as the owner of a small repair shop in a quiet Midwestern town. Ever since his wife walked out one autumn night 6 years ago, Marshall had focused on one mission: raising his daughter, Amber. He vowed she would never feel lesser, even if he had to skip meals or sleep in the garage to get an extra shift done. Amber was only 3 at the time of her mother's departure, too young to know the weight her father carried. Now at 9, she possessed an irrepressible spirit and a limitless curiosity that reminded Marshall daily why he kept going. 3 years ago, Amber's eyes had lit up at a magazine cover featuring a high-end restaurant called Le Savarin. She'd seen a glamorous photo of women in evening gowns and men in tailored suits. Soft candles glowed in the background, and the plates looked like art. She'd whispered, in that small, hopeful voice only a child can have, that one day she wanted a birthday dinner there. Marshall had laughed it off at first, telling her it was just a place in a glossy ad, not for people like them. But that night, her excitement had lingered in his mind, and he promised himself he would make it happen. Somehow, at first, saving up money had been slow. He was behind on rent. The old fridge had broken down. The roof of his small rental house lagged whenever the rain got too heavy. But each time he put away a few dollars, sometimes 5, sometimes 10, he kept imagining the look on Amber's face when she sat down among the chandeliers and velvet drapes of Le Savarin. Over the next 3 years, Marshall quietly built up a small fund labeled Amber's Magic. He didn't tell a soul, not even his best friend from the Army, because he worried if he said it aloud, the dream might slip away. Amber knew nothing of the finances behind this plan. She only saw glimpses of her father's exhaustion and heard the occasional creak of his bones after a 12-hour shift. She was a sturdy kid, always pushing the limits of her skateboard on the cracked sidewalks, or sneaking into the garage to hand him wrenches while he worked on cars. She made jokes about Dad's top-secret piggy bank, but never pressed for details. It was enough for her to know he kept his promises. As her 9th birthday approached, Marshall finally had enough to afford one lavish evening, one chance to show Amber a life outside dingy waiting rooms and secondhand clothes. He called the restaurant a full month in advance, setting the reservation for a Friday evening at 7. He told Amber to wear the best dress she had, while he tried to mend his old sport jacket with worn elbows. On the morning of her birthday, Marshall woke up extra early, rummaged through his closet for a clean shirt, and took out a pair of shoes he'd last polished in his Army days. He was nervous, almost trembling with a mixture of dread and anticipation. In the back of his mind, he kept hearing the echo of his ex-wife's parting words, "You'll never escape this small life." But he had to believe there was something better waiting for Amber, some small slice of magic he could still give her. By 6 that evening, they climbed into his battered pickup truck, hearts pounding as they set off for Le Savarin, where the crisp autumn air seemed to crackle with possibility. Amber held onto her father's arm with both hands as they walked up to Le Savarin's ornate entrance. In a child's eyes, the building looked like a castle tall, arched windows with golden light shining out, and big wooden doors engraved with elegant lettering. Her lilac dress, lovingly stitched by Marshall from an old thrift store find, fluttered around her ankles. She wore sparkly flats that had cost Marshall nearly a week's tips, nothing extravagant by the standards of the wealthy, but precious to them. Marshall himself wore a threadbare jacket and a pair of slacks he had owned since his Army discharge. He had ironed them carefully that morning, using an ancient iron that sputtered steam at all the wrong moments. The moment they stepped into the foyer, a hush seemed to envelop them. The marble floors gleamed under chandeliers shaped like upside-down bouquets. Gentle music played from somewhere hidden, and waiters in pristine uniforms glided among the tables. Amber's eyes went wide. She looked up at Marshall and whispered, "It's just like the picture, Daddy." Marshall managed a tense smile, trying to ignore how out of place he felt. He could smell the subtle aroma of roasted herbs, truffle oil, and fresh bread. For 3 years, he had imagined this moment. He had thought it would be triumphant. But as they approached the maitre d' stand, trouble began. A tall man with slicked back hair and a meticulously pressed suit gave them a once-over that was as cold as a New England winter. His name tag read Randall Burke, but the arch of his eyebrows said more than any formal greeting could. Marshall cleared his throat and stated their reservation details. "Reeves, 7 o'clock." Randall's polite smile hardened. He flipped through the reservation ledger with theatrical slowness, then shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir," Randall said in a tone that felt anything but apologetic. "We don't have a reservation under that name." Marshall's stomach turned. He was certain he had called. He even remembered spelling out Reeves letter by letter for the hostess on the phone. "There must be some mix-up," he insisted, trying to keep his voice calm for Amber's sake. "I called a month ago." Randall held up a gloved hand to silence him, eyebrows knitting in faint annoyance. "We have a strict dress code at Le Savarin," he stated, voice dripping condescension. "And we are fully booked tonight." Behind them, two other patrons dressed in designer clothes slipped past into the main dining area without any question. Marshall swallowed hard. He felt Amber's small hand grip his forearm more tightly. She tried to read his face, her young eyes brimming with confusion. "But it's my birthday," she murmured, too softly for Randall to hear. Marshall turned to Amber, forcing a reassuring smile. He couldn't let her see how this moment, the one he had dreamed of, was collapsing. He tried reasoning with Randall one more time, explaining they had a legitimate reservation. Randall's lips formed a thin line, as if each word from Marshall was a personal inconvenience. The maitre d' closed the ledger with a snap. "I'm sure you did call," he said smoothly, not bothering to hide his disbelief. "But we have to maintain a certain standard here. Perhaps another establishment would be more suitable." A wave of heat flooded Marshall's face, equal parts rage and humiliation. He could hear faint laughter from someone in the lounge area. Amber's eyes were starting to shine with tears she refused to shed. This was it, he realized. The moment he feared being told in front of his daughter that they didn't belong. He opened his mouth to protest again, but only a strained breath emerged. Amber tugged at his sleeve. "It's okay, Daddy," she whispered, swallowing her disappointment. "We can go somewhere else." Marshall felt his heart crack. 3 years of saving, 3 years of hope, and they were about to walk out the door as if they were nothing. Just as Marshall turned toward the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. A voice rang out from across the foyer, calm yet commanding, each word sharp as a blade. "Pardon me, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The voice belonged to a woman stepping forward from the corner of the waiting area, a woman neither young nor old, and with refined features and eyes that could quiet a room. She wore a tailored black coat, and her silvery hair was pinned back in a simple, elegant twist. Randall stiffened, pivoting abruptly. Marshall noticed the maitre d's expression shift from dismissive arrogance to a strained politeness as soon as he laid eyes on her. It was as if, in that single glance, she outranked him in every conceivable social hierarchy. "Miss Delacroix," he said, with a bow of his head that was halfway respectful, halfway fearful. "Is there something I can assist you with?" She introduced herself as Iris Delacroix, and something about her presence felt immediately steadying. She stepped closer to Marshall and Amber, looking them over with a kindness absent from every other gaze in the restaurant so far. "I was seated in the lounge," Iris said, keeping her voice level, "and I couldn't help overhearing the conversation." She nodded at Amber, who shrank shyly behind her father's arm. "This young lady has a birthday tonight, if I'm not mistaken. Are we truly going to deny her a celebration simply because of Iris let her words hang?" implying everything from dress code to financial standing. Marshall stood there, torn between gratitude and embarrassment. He'd always believed in solving his own battles. Yet here was this stranger standing up for them. Amber peeked out, her eyes darting between Iris and her father, unsure of who this elegant woman was. Randall forced a tight smile, struggling to maintain his composure. Ms. Delacroix, as you know, Le Savarin holds a certain reputation. Our reservation list is quite full, funny. Iris interrupted, her tone as gentle as a scalpel. I was under the impression that I was one of the principal investors in the Savarin Group. That means your reputation is partly my responsibility. She pulled a slim phone from her purse, glancing down as if verifying some text or data. I could have sworn I saw a family of 4 seated just a moment ago without a formal booking. A flush crept up Randall's neck. We made an exception for them because they're regular patrons. He stammered. Surely you understand. Iris's gaze hardened. What I understand is that you're embarrassing this father and his daughter, and I don't appreciate it. She turned to Marshall, softening her expression. If you two don't mind, I would be honored if you'd join me at my table tonight. Birthdays are meant to be celebrated. After all, Amber's face lit up with a cautious hope. Marshall hesitated, pride warring with relief, his fists unclenched at his sides, and for a second he felt the sting of tears behind his eyes. He cleared his throat. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Delacroix, but I don't want to impose. Iris shook her head. Nonsense. Please, it's the least we can do. Then, fixing Randall with one last pointed look, she added, we wouldn't want our staff to forget what hospitality truly means. Would we, with that? She gestured for Marshall and Amber to follow her. As they moved past Randall, Marshall glanced at the maitre d's face, seeing in it the thwarted cruelty of someone who had just been publicly reprimanded. The dining room of Le Savarin was a scene straight out of a lifestyle magazine. Candles flickered on each table. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light onto polished silverware, and the low murmur of conversation hummed in the background. Marshall felt conspicuously aware of the oil stains he'd never quite managed to scrub off his calloused fingers. He gripped Amber's hand as they followed Iris through the maze of tables, every step seeming to echo with the question, do we really belong here? But Iris walked with such calm assurance, as if guiding them through her own living room, that it steadied Marshall's nerves. She led them to a large round table near the corner, partially hidden by a velvet curtain. The corner spot felt both private and opulent. There were plush chairs with high backs, a centerpiece of fresh lilies, and an unobstructed view of the entire dining hall. Amber's eyes sparkled. She looked ready to spin in circles at the wonder of it all. Please, Iris said, holding out a seat for Amber. Birthday girls get the best seat in the house. Amber slid onto the cushioned seat, her feet barely reaching the plush carpet beneath. She offered a small smile, still unsure how to handle such grand gestures. Marshall took the seat beside her, feeling the swirl of conflicting emotions. Gratitude, apprehension, and a lingering anger at the injustice they'd just faced. Once they were settled, a waiter appeared clearly more deferential this time. He placed menus in front of them with an extra flourish. Though Marshall noticed his discreet glances at Amber's worn dress and his own jacket, still, Iris's presence seemed to shield them from any further disrespect. The waiter asked if they'd like to start with something to drink. Amber looked up at her father hopefully, as if she'd never even considered the possibility of fancy beverages. Before Marshall could reply, Iris interjected softly, "We'll have one sparkling cider for the young lady, and a glass of your house red for me." She looked to Marshall. "And for you?" Marshall hesitated. He rarely drank wine, couldn't afford it, but he also didn't want to seem ungrateful. "Same as you, I guess," he said awkwardly. With a nod, the waiter vanished, leaving a delicate hush around the table. For a moment, none of them spoke. Amber used the tip of her finger to trace the embroidered pattern on the tablecloth. Marshall fiddled with his silverware, making sure not to leave smudges. Finally, "Ma," Iris broke the silence by leaning forward and focusing on Amber. "So," she said, her voice friendly, "did you have a good birthday so far?" Dear Amber nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. I mean, It was just a normal day until now. Dad bought me donuts this morning. She glanced at Marshall, smiling. But I really wanted to come here because, she faltered, cheeks reddening slightly, because it looked magical. Iris's lips curved into a gentle smile. And does it feel magical now that you're here? Amber nodded again, more confidently this time. Yes. Thank you for letting us stay, she whispered. Iris placed a hand over Amber's, a silent gesture of reassurance. Turning her gaze to Marshall, Iris added in a voice equally warm, and thank you for humoring me. I'm sorry you had to experience such unkindness at the door. I'd like to make sure this night is memorable for the right reasons. Marshall let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I appreciate it, Miss Delacroix, more than you know. Menus were opened, and soon the table was filled with discussions of dishes that sounded far more sophisticated than anything Marshall had ever encountered. Foie gras terrine, duck à l'orange, bouillie le best, words that made Amber's eyes go round with both curiosity and confusion. She tugged on her father's sleeve. Dad, she whispered. Which one do I pick? The truth was, Marshall had no idea. He'd mentally prepared for this dinner by setting aside money, but not by learning the nuances of French cuisine. He wanted to offer Amber the best, but found himself equally clueless. Noticing the struggle, Iris gently suggested a few dishes. She pointed to an entree of roasted chicken with rosemary and garlic for Amber, simple but still elegantly presented. For Marshall, she recommended a hearty beef bourguignon. He hesitated, worried about the price, but she leaned in and said softly, "Let me handle this tonight." Okay. Before he could argue, a voice behind them spoke up, lilting, formal. The waiter had returned with a bread basket and their drinks. An excellent choice. Madame Delacroix. Will there be anything else to start? Perhaps our signature oyster platter? Iris nodded. Yes, let's do that as well. Marshall's heart skipped. Oysters? That sounded expensive. He opened his mouth to say something, but Iris shot him a reassuring look. Just enjoy, she whispered. As the waiter stepped away, Amber reached for a slice of warm bread. She took a delicate nibble, as though trying to match the composure of the other diners. Marshall caught the slight tremor in her hand. She was putting on her best fancy behavior. It pained him that she felt she had to be someone else here, in a place that was supposed to be her dream come true. He reached out and patted her shoulder gently. Don't worry, he said. We're allowed to eat bread without pinkies up. Okay. Amber giggled, tension easing. Iris observed them silently for a moment, the corners of her eyes softening. You remind me of someone, she said to Marshall. Swirling her wine, my father was also a mechanic, though he fixed tractors on a farm. He used to come home reeking of diesel, dirt under his nails. But he was the kindest man I ever knew. Surprise flickered across Marshall's face. He had assumed Iris was born into privilege, the way she navigated these upscale surroundings. He must have been a hard worker, he said softly. Iris nodded. Very. We didn't have much, but he taught me compassion. He used to say, if you walk by someone who's fallen down, you either lift them up or you'll both be on the ground eventually. She tapped the table with her manicured nail. Money came later. And by then, I realized it doesn't make you a better person. It just makes it easier to show the world who you really are. Amber, half listening, half absorbed in her bread, seemed taken by Iris's words. Marshall felt a stir of respect for this woman who had stepped into their night at exactly the right moment. The raw humiliation he'd felt at the door started to subside, replaced by cautious gratitude. He still had no idea why someone like Iris would care so much, but he couldn't deny the comfort of her presence. The wine, smooth and rich, helped, too. When the oysters arrived, arranged on a bed of ice with lemon wedges and tiny sauce cups, Amber looked at them with a mix of horror and awe. They looked slimy. She giggled, though she tried to be polite. Iris laughed, lifting one shell delicately. They do, but they're an adventure. Want to try? Amber glanced at her father, seeking approval. Marshall nodded, smiling. Go ahead, kiddo. When's the next time we'll see something like this? The main courses arrived in steaming, aromatic splendor. Amber's roasted chicken lay nestled on a bed of sautéed vegetables, the skin glistening with buttery herbs. Marshall's beef bourguignon came in a deep dish, the rich sauce swirling around tender chunks of meat. He inhaled the aroma with a sense of disbelief. He had never imagined a stew could smell so complex, layers of wine and thyme wafting up like a promise of comfort. Meanwhile, Iris's plate featured a delicately seared salmon, drizzled with a vibrant green sauce that looked almost too pretty to eat. Conversation ebbed and flowed as they ate. Iris asked Amber about her favorite school subject, science. It turned out because she loved learning how the world worked. Then she asked Marshall about his time in the Army, carefully avoiding any prying into potential traumas. He shrugged, saying he was just a mechanic stationed stateside most of the time, fixing Humvees and trucks before they shipped out. The biggest battles I fought were with rusted bolts, he joked, but there was an undercurrent of something unspoken in his eyes. They spoke of simpler things as well, the best ways to fix a flat tire. Amber's dream of one day visiting an aquarium, and Iris's recollection of how she learned to drive a tractor at age 12. Despite the elegant surroundings, the conversation felt almost homelike, as though they were three friends sharing a meal in a cozy kitchen. Marshall noticed that fewer heads were turning their way now. The spectacle of a father and daughter who didn't belong had faded. Or maybe it was overshadowed by Iris's assured presence. Halfway through the meal, Randall Burke made a stiff appearance at the table. His face remained carefully neutral, though a strain around his eyes hinted at discomfort. "Is everything satisfactory, Ms. Delacroix?" he asked, ignoring Marshall and Amber as if they were invisible. Iris dabbed her napkin at the corner of her mouth before answering. "Yes, everything is lovely," she said, not a hint of warmth in her voice. "Though I must say I'd hoped for a more gracious welcome earlier." Her words were pointed, and Randall's jaw tightened. He bowed slightly, mumbling something that sounded like an apology, and retreated before Iris could say more. Marshall stared after him, anger flashing, but Iris placed a calming hand on his forearm. "Don't let him ruin the moment," she said softly. "Some people care more about polish than they do about humanity. They'll learn the hard way that it's a shallower way to live." Amber, oblivious to the tension, poked her father. "Dad, taste this potato," she said, pushing her plate toward him. She was beaming, cheeks flushed with the warmth of the evening. For a moment, all the embarrassment, frustration, and decades of class divide melted away in the glow of a little girl's delight. Marshall took the offered bite, savoring the buttery richness, and smiled back at Amber. This was the feeling he had scrimped and saved for her unguarded happiness. Dessert came next, a meticulously presented chocolate souffle topped with powdered sugar that glimmered under the chandelier light. Amber squealed in amazement, carefully spooning into it while trying not to destroy the delicate structure. Iris watched her with a wistful grin. "I remember being that age," she said under her breath. So quietly, Marshall almost didn't catch it. The world seemed so full of possibility. Before long, the plates were cleared, leaving behind an array of empty dishes and half-full wine glasses. The table was a testament to the kind of decadent feast Marshall had never experienced and probably never would again. His heart felt heavy with gratitude, but also with the pragmatic knowledge that this was a one-night miracle. He quietly vowed to repay Iris somehow, though he still didn't understand the depth of her kindness or the story behind her generosity. But for now, he let Amber revel in the glow of her birthday dream come true. As the dinner wound down, Marshall's discomfort about the impending check gnawed at him. He had planned to pay for a modest meal, certainly not the lavish spread they'd just enjoyed. When the waiter finally returned with the bill, he placed it gently in front of Iris. Marshall felt a flutter of panic. He reached across the table, voice tense. I can cover some of it, at least." This was not what I intended when I saved up. Iris shook her head, sliding the little leather folder away from him. "Consider it my birthday gift to Amber." She held up a hand to forestall his protest. "And a gift to you, Marshall, for reminding me why I got into this business in the first place." Marshall hesitated, conflicting emotions warring in his eyes. The cost of the meal likely dwarfed what he spent on groceries in a month. Yet, how could he argue without seeming ungrateful? Amber looked between them, sensing her father's predicament, but not fully understanding the financial stakes. She only knew this was her birthday, and for once, the world felt kind. Finally, Charmon. Marshall nodded, swallowing his pride. I appreciate it, he said quietly. More than words can say. He gently placed a hand on Amber's shoulder, noticing the way she beamed at Iris as if the woman were some sort of fairy godmother. And maybe in a sense she was. When they rose from the table, a hush of respectful interest followed them. Iris led them toward the exit, her hand lightly clasping Amber's. In the foyer, Randall Burke stood like a statue, face locked in an expression that tried and failed to appear cordial. Iris stepped in front of him, giving him a pointed glance. Mr. Burke, she said coolly, I trust we won't have any more mix-ups with reservations in the future. Randall managed a tight smile, clearly seething inside. Of course not. Delacroix, we value all our patrons here. Marshall glanced between them, sensing more than just a client-employee relationship. Something about Iris's tone suggested she wielded substantial influence over Le Savarin, enough to dictate how staff should behave. But he left it alone, not wanting to dig into complexities that weren't his business. At least not tonight. Outside, the autumn air was crisp. Amber's breath made little clouds as she spun around to look up at the restaurant's facade, which glowed under ornate sconces. She grabbed her father's hand. Daddy, it was everything I dreamed, she said. Leaning her head against his side, he kissed the top of her head, heart swelling with love and relief that, despite the rocky start, the evening had turned out okay. Iris motioned to a sleek black sedan waiting at the curb, complete with a driver who stepped out and opened the rear door. Let me give you two a ride home, she offered, her voice warm but firm. Marshall hesitated. He still had his old pickup parked around the corner. The idea of climbing into a luxury car, letting Amber see that side of life even more intimately, made him worry about expectations he couldn't fulfill again. But the look on Amber's face, tired, yet glowing with wonder, made the decision easier. Marshall exhaled, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. All right, sure. He gave the driver a polite nod, lifting Amber into the back seat, where soft leather and a faint vanilla scent surrounded them. He slid in beside her, and Iris took the seat across, gracefully folding her coat in her lap. The car hummed quietly as it merged into light city traffic. Streetlights flashed across Amber's half-lidded eyes, and she leaned against Marshall's arm, fighting sleep. Iris observed them with a faint smile, as though cataloging a precious moment. Marshall offered directions to a spot a few blocks from his actual home address, not wanting the driver to see the rundown building where they lived. But Iris, seemingly reading his mind, responded softly, I'll drop you off exactly where you're comfortable. Marshall gave a non-committal nod. Despite the evening's warmth, the gap between Iris's world and his own loomed large. The last thing he wanted was for Amber to think they could dwell in the lap of luxury. This was a special night, a dream he'd crafted for years. But a dream was all it could remain. You've been too generous, he said, breaking the silence. I don't even know how to repay you. Iris tilted her head, her silver hair catching stray beams of streetlight. Who said anything about repayment? She hesitated for a moment, then added, Do you know why I became an investor in places like Le Savarin? Not just for profit. It's to create experiences, ones that make people feel valued and special. I lost sight of that for a while, until tonight reminded me. Something in her voice, an undercurrent of sorrow, made Marshall wonder about her past. But he only said, You did create an experience. For Amber. I mean, she'll never forget this birthday. Iris's lips curved in a gentle smile. That's all I need to hear. The sedan came to a smooth stop near a quiet intersection lined with dimly lit shops. Marshall carefully lifted Amber, who was half asleep, into his arms. When he glanced back at Iris, he found her extending a small business card between her fingers. It was minimalist, printed on thick, matte paper. He read the name Iris Delacroix, followed by a phone number and a single line, the Delacroix Foundation. He looked up, puzzled. Iris spoke before he could ask. If you ever want to change or if you need resources for Amber's education, call me. We run vocational programs, scholarships, that sort of thing. You said you were once in the Army as a mechanic, right? We've got a new initiative for veterans who want to open their own garages. Real hands-on help. Marshall blinked, the possibilities flooding him with a bewildering mix of hope and fear. He could almost hear his own excuses forming. I'm fine on my own. I don't need charity. But when he glanced at Amber, dozing peacefully, he thought of the future he owed her. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Iris gave him a soft nod. Just think about it. No pressure. She smiled again at Amber, then looked back at Marshall. Good night, Mr. Reeves, and happy birthday to your little girl. He stepped onto the sidewalk, cradling Amber, and watched as the sedan rolled away, its taillights disappearing around a corner. The street lamp above buzzed, flickering for a second. Marshall glanced at the card in his hand, feeling its weight beyond mere paper. Part of him wanted to believe in that offer, in the idea that a better life was within reach if he just said yes. But he'd learned the hard way that kindness could be fleeting. Pocketing the card, he walked a few blocks home, carefully so as not to jostle Amber. A passing bus rumbled by, drenching them in a flash of fluorescent light, then vanishing into the darkness. One night, he thought, unlocking the worn door to his apartment building. One perfect night. The apartment block where Marshall lived was a battered relic of the post-war era. Stairwells smelled of mold and faint cigarette smoke, and half the overhead lights flickered or stayed out entirely. He carried Amber up 3 flights to their small unit, her arms dangling limply around his neck, her face peaceful in slumber. He placed her gently onto her narrow bed, pulling up a thin blanket decorated with cartoon planets, her makeshift space adventure. Smoothing a lock of hair from her forehead, he felt a swell of fierce love. Tonight had been a victory, albeit a borrowed one. In the living room, he flicked on a single lamp, revealing the worn couch and a small TV precariously balanced on a second-hand stand. On the coffee table lay scattered envelopes, unpaid bills, junk mail, a few discount flyers. It was a sharp contrast to the lavish scene at Les Savarin. Pulling Iris's card from his jacket pocket, he traced the embossed lettering with a calloused thumb, the Delacroix Foundation. He could hardly imagine stepping into that world for real. Yet something about the evening lingered, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had glimpsed a path toward more than mere survival. Marshall placed the card between the pages of a repair manual on the table, telling himself he'd think about it later. Slumping onto the couch, he let out a deep exhale. The emotional toll of the night made him feel heavier than any physical labor. He replayed the humiliating moment with Randall Burke, the rescue by Iris, and the wonder in Amber's eyes as they ate dessert. Usually at this hour, he'd doze off with some old Western on TV, but not tonight. His mind buzzed like a faulty spark plug. Minutes turned into an hour before he realized the phone was vibrating on the armrest. He picked it up to find a text from an unknown number. I hope Amber had a magical birthday. Warm regards, Iris. Marshall's first reaction was suspicion. He wasn't used to strangers contacting him so personally. But then he recalled she had given him her card. He considered ignoring it, but something about the sincerity of her message made him type back, she's asleep, but smiling. Thank you again. M.R. Setting the phone aside, Marshall rubbed his temples, feeling the swirl of gratitude and vulnerability. He thought about the men he'd served with in the Army, how they used to say real bravery wasn't about charging into battle, but facing life day after day with no guarantee of a medal. This is just another kind of battle, he told himself. For me, for Amber. He turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. Outside, a car alarm wailed briefly, then stopped. The city seemed oblivious to his small victories and heartbreaks. Tomorrow, it would be back to routine up at dawn. Amber off to school, then to the repair shop. He wondered if he should mention the Delacroix Foundation to his boss, or if he should keep it to himself. He wasn't even sure he'd call them. As his eyes finally slid shut, The last image that flickered in his mind was Iris offering that card a door he could choose to open or quietly close forever. The next week unfolded in the usual blur of labor and small-town routine. Marshall returned to his repair shop, a squat concrete building a few blocks from the industrial train tracks. His boss, Hank Peterman, was a grizzled man in his 60s who had taken Marshall under his wing when he'd first come back from the Army. They rarely exchanged more than a grunt in the morning and a curt nod at quitting time, but their unspoken camaraderie ran deep. Hank had saved Marshall's job more than once when times got tough. On Tuesday, while calibrating a busted carburetor, Marshall felt his phone vibrate. He nearly ignored it. He despised being that guy with a phone glued to his hand, but a tiny flicker of hope made him check. The screen read unknown number. He wiped grease off his fingers and accepted the call, stepping behind a stack of used tires. "Marshall, this is Iris Delacroix," came the familiar voice. A swirl of guilt and awkwardness tightened his chest. He realized he'd never called her foundation, never said more than that single text reply. He stammered an apology, something about being busy. Iris brushed it aside with gracious ease. "I imagine you're a busy man," she said. "I just wanted to let you know we have an open house at the Delacroix Foundation next Friday. It's mostly for veterans and their families. To see what programs might interest them, I thought you might like to stop by." Marshall looked at the grease staining his fingertips. The carburetor half disassembled on the bench. Next Friday, he mentally tabulated the day's task he had to pick Amber up after school. Then he had a promise to fix Hank's old generator. But then again, he heard the memory of Amber's laughter at the restaurant. "Yeah," he said abruptly. "I'll see if I can swing by." Iris sounded genuinely pleased. "Wonderful. I'll text you the address." And Marshall, there's no commitment, just an invitation. He ended the call feeling a strange mix of anticipation and dread. For the rest of the day, he vacillated between ignoring the invitation and planning exactly what time he could get there. Hank caught him drifting off mid-task and barked, "You got your head in the clouds. That carburetor won't fix itself." Boy Marshall flushed and refocused on the job at hand, but a spark had already been lit inside him. That evening, he told Amber about the invitation over a dinner of leftover stew and rice. She paused, spoon hovering. "You mean that lady from the fancy restaurant?" Her eyes shone. "Can I come? I want to see where she works." Marshall hesitated, not wanting to set Amber up for disappointment if this turned out to be a dead end. But the excitement in her face swayed him. "I'll ask," he said, "but let's not get our hopes up too high." Amber grinned. "Dad, it's just an open house. We don't have to be rich to walk in the door, right?" He laughed, ruffling her hair. "No, we don't." Her simplistic logic reminded him again of how easy the world was in a child's eyes. No locked gates, no unspoken class barriers. So he told himself he'd at least visit the foundation, see what it was about. Worst case, he'd waste an afternoon. Best case, maybe there was a future beyond working at Hank's shop for the next 20 years. But that night, alone in the living room after Amber went to bed, he found his mind conjuring images of Iris, the luminous dining hall of Le Savarin, and that business card that signified a door he wasn't entirely sure he was ready to walk through. The following Friday arrived, bringing with it a brisk wind that signaled the start of a true autumn chill. Amber bounded out of her school's front doors at the final bell, her worn backpack bouncing against her small frame. Marshall leaned against his truck, arms crossed. He still hadn't decided whether to drive to the Delacroix Foundation. It was a solid 30 minutes away, located in a renovated brick warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He had half a mind to go home and pretend the invitation never happened. "Daddy, are we going?" Amber's eyes were wide with anticipation. He felt a stab of guilt for even considering a no-show. He nodded gruffly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, hop in." She climbed into the passenger seat, and they set off. All the way, Marshall kept telling himself this was just a look-see. Maybe he'd figure out how to say politely, "Thanks, but no thanks. I'm just a small-town mechanic trying to raise a kid." They arrived at a campus that looked more like a community center than some highbrow institution. A large sign near the entrance read, The Delacroix Foundation, Empowering Futures. The brick facade bore murals of veterans, children, and people working side by side, images that hinted at collaboration and possibility. Families, many with toddlers in tow, trickled through double glass doors. Marshall spotted older men wearing baseball caps embroidered with military insignias, some in wheelchairs, others walking with canes. Amber hopped out excitedly. As they stepped inside, the warmth of the building and the buzz of conversation enveloped them. Bright overhead lights illuminated a reception area where a friendly volunteer handed them name tags. Beyond, an open floor plan revealed various booths and stations, job placement, mental health counseling, small business grants, educational workshops. Marshall felt overwhelmed by the sense of scope. He realized the foundation was more than just a philanthropic hobby for a wealthy patron. It was a hive of real services. Amber pulled him toward a corner where a group of older veterans demonstrated mechanical equipment. At a table loaded with toolkits and engine parts, she excitedly pointed, "Dad, look, they have an engine just like the one we worked on." Indeed, it was a model of a small engine, the kind used in generators or lawnmowers. An older man with a kindly face, wearing a retired Navy cap, nodded hello. Marshall introduced himself, somewhat awkwardly, and found the man eager to chat about all things mechanical. After a few minutes, a familiar voice called out, "Marshall, Amber." They turned to see Iris Delacroix striding toward them. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, with none of the formal elegance from that night at the restaurant, but her presence was just as commanding. Her eyes lit up when she saw Amber geeking out over the engine. "I'm so glad you made it," Iris said. Extending her hand, she offered no pomp or flourish, just genuine warmth. "It's bigger than I imagined," Marshall admitted, sweeping his gaze across the busy space. "You do a lot here." Iris nodded, guiding them toward an open area with chairs arranged in rows, where a short presentation was underway. "We try. We have programs for vets returning from service, single parents needing career shifts, students who want apprenticeships. Our goal is to remove barriers: financial, educational, social." She paused, glancing at Amber. "You mentioned your father's great with cars, right? Maybe he can help us expand our workshop." Marshall's heart thumped. The possibility that she'd want his input felt simultaneously flattering and terrifying. He was so used to being overlooked that the idea of stepping up in a leadership capacity seemed foreign. He managed a laugh. "I'm not sure I'm foundation material." Iris smiled, touching his elbow gently. "Marshall, you're exactly the kind of person this place is for." They joined a small crowd seated before a makeshift stage. A young man wearing a prosthetic leg spoke about how the foundation had funded his welding certification. Next, a single mother shared how she'd been trained in bookkeeping and now worked remotely, supporting her children without needing 3 part-time jobs. The stories had a raw authenticity, each one echoing the challenges Marshall knew all too well, scraping by, never quite catching a break. Amber sat on Marshall's lap, fidgeting but transfixed by each speaker. In the soft overhead lighting, Marshall could see Iris standing off to the side, arms folded lightly across her waist, watching him watch the presentation. When the panel ended, scattered applause broke out. A staff member announced that refreshments were available and that visitors could roam freely to ask questions at the various booths. A swirl of motion ensued as people dispersed. Iris approached them with a gentle smile. "Impressive, right?" she asked, gesturing toward the stage. "These are the success stories, but they started with duad, same as everyone else." Marshall let Amber slip off his lap so she could wander around the mechanical booth again. He took a moment to gather his thoughts. "I guess I never realized organizations like this could do so much real work," he admitted. "I always assumed it was mostly PR or tax write-offs." Iris gave a wry chuckle. "Oh, there's PR and tax benefits. No denying that. But I started this foundation after I inherited my late husband's estate. We'd grown our wealth together. But once he passed, I realized how fleeting money can be. I wanted to do something that lasted. Something that helped people who were like us decades ago, trying to climb out of nothing." Marshall heard the tremor in her voice at the mention of her husband. He understood that kind of pain, the lingering ache of absence. Quietly, he said, "I'm sorry for your loss." She inclined her head in thanks, her expression flickering with gratitude for his empathy. They strolled over to the workshop demonstration area, where kids tinkered with small engines under adult supervision. Amber joined in, her eager voice carrying across the space. A staff member explained that the foundation aimed to open a more advanced vehicle maintenance program if they could find the right instructors and resources. Marshall's mind churned. He pictured himself teaching a group of teens, or maybe young veterans, how to handle a wrench. He imagined showing them the ropes, passing on the knowledge he'd learned from the Army and from years of scrounging in small-town shops. It both excited and terrified him. He'd spent so long just surviving. He'd never considered the possibility of leading. And yet here was a place that actually wanted his skills. "What's the catch?" he blurted out, glancing at Iris. "You offer all these programs, resources. There's got to be a catch, right?" She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "We have grants, donations, corporate sponsors, but we're always in need of good, committed people to run them. If you're asking about a trick or hidden agenda, there isn't one. This is just what we do." A coil of tension unwound in Marshall's chest, replaced by a cautious spark of hope. "So, if I wanted to get involved, how would that work?" Iris glanced at Amber, who was busy loosening a bolt under the watchful eye of a volunteer. Her expression softened. "We'd talk details, see what you can commit to. You could start part-time, keep your job at Hank's shop. We'd pay you a stipend for instruction hours. Then if it fits, you transition more. No pressure, just a conversation." Marshall nodded slowly. The idea of stepping beyond his comfort zone both invigorated and unnerved him. But as he watched Amber deftly handle that bolt, he realized he owed it to her and maybe to himself to see if a bigger life was possible. "All right," he said, voice almost shaky. "Let's set up a meeting." The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Marshall visited the foundation's offices again, this time without Amber, to discuss a potential pilot program in automotive maintenance. He met staff members who specialized in curriculum design, community outreach, and grant writing terms that once sounded foreign but now intrigued him. The foundation offered him a modest hourly rate to teach twice a week in the evenings, a schedule that wouldn't interfere with his day job at Hank's. He accepted tentatively, half waiting for the deal to collapse, for someone to say, "Whoops, we made a mistake picking you." But that moment never came. Instead, the foundation folks treated him as a valuable asset, a man with real-world knowledge to pass on. It felt surreal. One crisp afternoon, Iris dropped by his repair shop. She arrived unannounced, stepping out of a humble sedan, not the chauffeured ride from before. Wearing casual slacks and a light jacket, she greeted Hank with a polite handshake. Marshall, who had been elbow-deep in a faulty engine, wiped off his hands, surprised to see her there. Hank squinted, taking in the poised woman with an air of curiosity. "You're the lady from that foundation, right?" he asked bluntly. "The one Marshall's have been telling me about." Iris smiled. "Yes, Iris Delacroix. I wanted to see where Marshall works, maybe get a better sense of the environment we'll recreate in our training program." Marshall cast an apologetic glance at Hank. He hadn't prepared him for an unannounced visit, but Hank merely shrugged, waving them toward the back where an array of half-dismantled cars and spare parts lived in perpetual chaos. "Ain't much, but it's functional," Hank said gruffly. As Iris surveyed the cluttered space, her eyes lit up with genuine interest. She asked Hank about the shop's history, learning it had been in his family for 2 generations. Hank, surprised by her enthusiasm, warmed to her presence. He even showed her the old bench press used for shaping metal parts, a tool that dated back to his grandfather's era. Iris turned to Marshall. "This kind of hands-on learning is exactly what we want to replicate at the foundation. We could use your expertise to lay out the floor plan for our new workshop, pick the right tools, that sort of thing." Marshall felt a swell of pride, realizing she saw him as more than just a mechanic, more like a consultant, an expert. The sense of being seen was both exhilarating and scary. "Sure, yeah, I'd be glad to help," he managed, pushing down the little voice in his head that whispered, "Why you?" Hank looked between them, then slapped a greasy rag against his thigh. "If you're gonna do it right, Reeves. But don't forget you still got a job here. Don't get too big for your britches." Iris laughed softly. "No worries, Mr. Peterman. We're not stealing him away, just borrowing his skills a couple evenings a week." A flicker of warmth passed between her and Marshall, an unspoken acknowledgement of how far they'd come from that humiliating moment at Le Savarin's doorway. They walked around the shop for another half hour, discussing practicalities. By the time Iris left, Marshall felt a sense of forward momentum that had been absent from his life for far too long. News travels fast in the small town, and soon people began whispering about how Marshall Reeves, the local mechanic, was working with some big foundation in the city. A few nights a week, he'd head out after closing up Hank's shop and drive to the Delacroix Foundation, where construction had already begun on the new automotive workshop. Amber sometimes came along, curling up in a corner with coloring books, while Marshall reviewed tool inventories or tested equipment. Meanwhile, the video from that fateful night at Le Savarin somehow leaked online, a short clip captured on a patron's smartphone, showing Randall Burke turning Marshall and Amber away. Then Iris stepping in. It spread on social media, drawing local interest. People recognized Marshall in the grocery store, commending him for how he handled the situation with dignity. Others reached out to the foundation, wanting to donate. It became a minor local sensation, shining a spotlight on the very issues of class discrimination that Iris's foundation aimed to tackle. Word got back to Le Savarin's higher-ups, and evidently, the negative press was enough that the management made a formal statement. They condemned Randall's behavior, announcing he'd been suspended pending further review. Part of Marshall felt vindicated. He remembered the humiliation in Amber's eyes, but he found he couldn't entirely revel in Burke's downfall. Instead, he chose to focus on the new doors opening in his own life. One evening, as Marshall tightened the last lug nut on a demonstration model at the foundation, Iris asked if he'd have dinner with her somewhere simpler this time, a modest diner around the corner. He agreed, though he felt a surge of nerves. They sat in a red vinyl booth, ordering burgers and fries, a stark contrast to the opulence of Le Savarin. Soft yellow light cast a warm glow over Iris's face as she explained how she'd grown up. She'd been the child of farm workers, lived in a drafty trailer for years, and only found relative comfort in her late 20s after she married her husband, a self-taught businessman who built his fortune from scratch. She spoke of her husband's death from a sudden illness, how she'd felt lost for a long time until she realized she could continue his legacy of investing in real people, just as he had once invested in her potential. Marshall listened, enthralled. The woman who had seemed so commanding at the restaurant had her own vulnerabilities, her own heartbreak. They swapped stories. Marshall recalled the first time he fixed a truck in the Army, the sense of purpose it gave him. He told her about the day Amber was born, how he almost passed out in the hospital room, but then held her tiny hand and knew life would never be the same. The conversation flowed so naturally that Marshall forgot to feel self-conscious. By the time the check came, he insisted on paying, pulling out a few crumpled bills. Iris started to protest, but then nodded with a grateful smile. Understanding this was his small way of restoring balance. As he walked her to her car, they lingered a moment under the flickering street lamp, neither wanting the evening to end. It felt both strange and comfortable, standing with a woman he barely knew, yet felt profoundly connected to. She reached out and gently squeezed his hand, her eyes conveying acceptance rather than pity. In that gesture, Marshall realized how much had changed in just a few short weeks. He was no longer the man who expected every door to slam in his face. On a chilly Saturday morning a month later, the new automotive workshop at the Delacroix Foundation officially opened. Rows of gleaming toolboxes lined the walls, along with half-assembled engines perched on sturdy workbenches. A small crowd had gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Veterans, local officials, families curious about free community classes. Bright balloons bobbed in the crisp air. Iris stood at the center, wearing a practical jacket and sensible boots. She gave a brief speech about opportunity, gratitude, and the power of second chances. Then she handed the oversized ceremonial scissors to Marshall, heart pounding. He stepped forward as Amber cheered from the sidelines. Hank, standing near the back with folded arms, gave Marshall a nod of grudging approval. Marshall cut the ribbon, the crowd applauding, and a swell of emotion threatened to choke him. He'd always been the guy in the background, the one turning wrenches while others cut ribbons. Now he was here, forging a new path not just for himself, but for the people who'd walk through these doors. After the ceremony, as guests milled about, Marshall guided small groups to the different stations, demonstrating the basic tools and explaining how each machine worked. He saw sparks of excitement in the eyes of men and women who'd long believed they had no better future. Amber darted around, beaming like the place was a carnival. Iris hovered discreetly, occasionally connecting with donors or speaking to reporters who'd come to cover the event. Yet her gaze always found Marshall, as if checking in to see if he was holding steady in this new role. Toward the end of the day, while the crowd thinned out, Iris and Marshall found a moment to talk in a quiet corner of the workshop. His face glistened with sweat, and a bit of motor oil smudged his brow, a testament to hands-on demonstrations. She teased him, offering a tissue. He laughed, feeling no embarrassment. I guess I'm still me, no matter where I go. She tilted her head, a warm gleam in her eyes. That's exactly who we need you to be, and I'm so proud of what you've done here. They stood in comfortable silence for a beat, the hum of leftover chatter in the background. Amber ran up, breathless. Dad, you gotta see there's a kid who wants to show you how he modded his go-kart engine. She grabbed Marshall's hand, pulling him away. He turned back to Iris, a grin spreading across his face. This is my life now. Huh. She smiled, watching them go. Yes, and it's a good one. In that moment, Marshall realized a fundamental truth sometimes. The biggest changes come from the smallest acts of kindness. A stranger had intervened at a restaurant door. A father had dared to dream a little bigger for his daughter. And now, in a renovated warehouse filled with tools, they stood on the precipice of a future that promised hope not just for them, but for anyone who walked through these doors in search of a new chance. The humiliating night at Le Savarin had transformed into the catalyst for a life he never thought possible, a testament to the power of compassion, perseverance, and the simple belief that everyone deserves a seat at the table. When he first stepped through those polished doors, he believed dignity was something others could take from him, that respect had a price tag he could never afford. But dignity isn't found in a fancy restaurant or bought with a pocket full of cash. It's earned quietly, piece by piece, in every decision to stand tall when life tries to knock you down. He learned the hard way that one small act of compassion could ripple outward, changing not only a single night, but the course of an entire life. For himself, for his daughter, for every person who walked through that new workshop door, he built something that couldn't be taken away. Hope. Sometimes the bravest battles aren't fought on distant battlefields, but in quiet towns, beneath worn-out streetlights, within hearts heavy with uncertainty. And maybe, just maybe, the true measure of a life isn't what the world says you deserve, but what you choose to build from what you're given. As the lights fade, consider this. Have you ever witnessed a moment when kindness changed someone's destiny, or perhaps your own?